The Nubia Z70 Ultra is looking to be a great phone for 2025. But of course, no phone is perfect. Some have strengths where others are lacking. So it's always good to do your research before diving in and buying a phone. Let's dive into this phone to see what I liked and didn't like about it early on. The first thing that I liked about it, because I'm a photography first type of person when it comes to phones, is the dedicated camera button. And it has all the features that you really want with a camera button. It starts up the camera without having to do anything special, just hold it down for a couple seconds. It has the half press so that you can focus before you decide to take the shot. And of course, it's actually a pretty soft press so that you're not moving without wanting to before taking the shot, removing any shakiness from the photo. Of course, there are other phones that have this, like the Sony does, but the Sony is like double the price, and then iPhone does, but their button was not that great. It's just too tough and it creates shake unless you have a very good grip on it. The second thing is the under display camera. This is the best iteration of under display cameras that I've seen, both in not being able to see it when I'm using the phone and also the quality of the photo that comes out of it. It's still not to the level of a punch hole camera because, I mean, that's just the best you can get at the moment, and I don't know for the foreseeable future also, but it's actually an acceptable photo, and it does a couple things too. It helps with the facial unlocking, which works pretty well with this phone. And it's just, for me, it's just the best thing about it is that you have a fully uninterrupted screen, and I actually have a tough time finding where the camera is when I'm watching a video. It's really good and probably my favorite screen of the year. At least it's in the running because I know Samsung's gonna have something special with the Ultra. The third thing is the new chip, and it's not gonna be exclusive to the Z70 Ultra, obviously, but it's one of the first ones that has the chip, and let me tell you that it feels snappier. Even from the Z70 to the Z60, there's this snappiness that you're getting. Just even the web pages are loading faster. The apps always open fast with the Snapdragons, so that's not really much improvement there, but just the other things that require a little more processing are noticeably faster. And I don't have any actual numbers to back this up. It's just that something that I'm feeling and noticing as I'm using them side by side. The other thing that I noticed with the chipset is that it hasn't really gotten hot for anything. I'm not saying that it won't get hot because every chip's gonna get hot if you push it. I think what's happening is that it's not being pushed. It's just cruising along and doing everything super fast without getting hot because it doesn't need to. And that's a benefit really, to having all that raw power in there and just not needing it all the time. And then the last thing that I think might be related to the chipset is gonna be that the photo optimization is looking pretty crisp and it's pretty fast. So it's just beneficial all the way around, and everything's just working really well together in the chipset department. The fourth thing is that I love the focal length of the main sensor. Having a 35mm equivalent is just something way different from the norm of 23 to 25. And it's kind of like that, the 35mm is kind of like that sweet spot when it comes to a lot of types of photography. And actually being a 35, you're gonna get naturally more background blur when you have the same f-stop on it of 1.6 to 1.8. So besides the focal length that's different, the output is actually really nice. And I've noticed that the bokeh on a lot of the photos that I take, on most of the photos that I take, are actually, it's already really good without even using portrait mode. It's like almost like I don't need portrait mode, even though I know in some situations you're gonna need it if you're further back, but if you're close enough to the subject, portrait mode is probably not even gonna be necessary. The last thing about it, which was probably the biggest upgrade to the camera this year, was the variable aperture. Now, it's not gonna be all too useful in all situations, but in some situations where you might be too close and part of your subject is being cut off or blurred, making the aperture go up in number, which makes it smaller, the hole a little bit smaller, is gonna help to expand the focus area. So it can help you in bringing things into focus, and it's gonna reduce the background blur obviously, but if you're really close to the subject, you're still gonna get plenty of background blur. The fifth thing is the overall improvement of the design. So it's still kept to the overall design aspects of the Z60, but it improved it in pretty much every single way. The first thing is that it's a lot smoother around the edges, and it's not uncomfortable to hold in any single situation or scenario. It's just very comfortable to hold, yet it's still squared off, so you get most of the screen usage compared to a phone that's rounded on the edges. The camera lenses were also reorganized and reshaped a bit, so it's more seamless. The other one kind of seemed very blocky, and this one is, even though it is square still, it fits better together. And then lastly, and probably even most important, is that it's lighter, because that's gonna help reduce the hand fatigue when you're holding it for a long time. And since this phone is good for gaming, you know, I can see a lot of people using this for gaming, and you don't game for 10-15 minutes. Usually it's for 30 minutes to 2 hours probably, and you're gonna get some fatigue at that point. So having it lighter is definitely gonna help with that. Number 6 is the charging speed and battery size combo. So having the larger battery is gonna help so much. It's not that much bigger than the Z60, but it's still bigger. And when you compare it to other phones that it's kind of competing against, it's quite a bit bigger at 6150 or 6150 milliamp hours. And then you pair that with 80-watt charging, and you're gonna get quick boosts anytime you want. So I don't know the exact time for a full charge, but at 80 watts, you're gonna get a full day's worth of charge in probably 15 minutes. So that's a big plus, especially if you're in a hurry and you gotta go. Before getting into the things that I didn't like about the phone, if you're enjoying this video and wanna see more videos like this in the future, click on the like and subscribe for future videos. So now let's get on to the worst list. And number 1 is gonna be the fingerprint reader. For starters, it's an optical fingerprint reader. So it's not gonna be as fast as ultrasonic, and it also has the side effect of blinding you if you happen to miss it by a little bit, because it has a blinding flash of light that it needs to read your fingerprint. So there's those two things about it. It also has a bit of a higher failure rate than the other phones that I've used, so that's a bit of a downer, but it's still good enough to use and rely on for the most part. For example, I haven't had 2 consecutive fails in a row, but the first one fails more often than with the other phones that I have, especially the ultrasonic ones. The second thing is the new camera setup. So I know I love the main camera, the way it's set up and everything, and the dedicated camera button, but they messed it up with the ultra wide and a couple of other things. For starters, the ultra wide is at 13 millimeters, which is just too wide for this setup. So it now has to cover over twice the distance or twice the focal length to reach the main sensor, and that's gonna lead to worse photos at the higher end of that range. To add to the ultra wide, it's also smaller. So now you have a smaller ultra wide that's gonna produce worse images to begin with, and you're extending the range that it needs to cover. And the third thing is also with the ultra wide, which they removed the OIS. I know when you're that far, electric stabilization is gonna be good enough for the most part, but the fact that the previous model, the previous generation had OIS, and now it doesn't, it's a step backwards. I'm thinking that might have been as a cost-cutting measure, because the new Snapdragon is probably more expensive than the previous generation. And then the last thing with the camera setup, it's a pretty small one, especially compared to the first ones that I mentioned. And it's that the telephoto is actually a bit smaller or closer in focal length compared to the previous generation. Now it's at 70 millimeter versus 85. The issue is that at 70 millimeter is gonna cut off the main sensor right at 2x, which if you have a specific setup, that could be beneficial. But for this setup, I don't think it's helping at all. It's just that the main sensor, which is the best sensor on the phone, is covering the least amount of range. And actually there was one more thing, which it's a simple one, and I don't understand why they don't have it. It's that they don't have 24 frames per second recording. I know it's not something that is that common to use, but I've been using it for quite a bit now, and I'm using it more on phones, and I feel like it does change the way your video looks. And it's, you know, if you have 30 frames and 60 frames per second, I don't see that it's gonna be any harder to do 24 when it's the slowest one. So it should require the least amount of processing. So that's more of just a setting that needs to be added, and I feel like it should have it, especially with a sensor this good. And my last negative is that it has no wireless charging. And I'm a big user of wireless charging. I have wireless stands everywhere, and I know it's not the most efficient, it's not the fastest, the phone gets hotter, and all these different things, But I don't care about that. The phone is a tool. It's gonna wear out, and honestly, I haven't had the wireless charging really do any significant damage that has made me notice that it's causing issues. So it's just, I'd rather have the convenience of wireless charging, and even though it's slower and all these different things, it's a big thing when you're trying to compete with, you know, other phones that might be a bit more premium. Of course, at this price range, it's understandable that they cut out a few things, wireless charging being one of them. But I can't imagine that wireless charging is that expensive anymore. But maybe it is, and they need to save that money. But it will be a nice thing to have, and this phone just doesn't have it. So overall, the Nubia Z70 Ultra is a great phone. I don't see too many things wrong with it, and the things that I pointed out are things you can mainly live with or live without. The one thing that I would say would hold me back from using this as my main phone is the lack of wireless charging, just because I rely on that a lot for pretty much all my charging needs. I've had issues in the past where the USB-C port failed on me. So having the backup of wireless charging would have been very beneficial, or it actually helped me out in those situations. So if I had this phone and it was stuck in a situation where the USB-C port was failing, then I wouldn't have any way of charging my phone, and it would basically just break my phone. Let me know what you think of this phone in the comments, and if you have another favorite phone that you would choose over this one, preferably in the same or similar price range, let me know what that is in the comments as well. And if you're interested in buying the phone, I do have an affiliate link in the description, and that would always be appreciated but not necessary. Either way, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.